Healthy Children Rounds. We're really delighted to welcome Professor Tanya Sharpe and Mr. Deshaun Hibbert. Full bios were in the invitation, but just very briefly, Dr. Sharpe is a Professor and Endowed Chair at the Factor-Inwentash Faculty of Social Work here at the U of T. And she's the founder and director of the Center for Research and Innovation for Black Survivors of Homicide Victims, the CRIB, which is what we will hear about today. And Deshaun Hibbert is a Toronto-based, he's a community leader, a youth advocate supporting individuals impacted by violence. And he is the neighborhood ambassador coordinator with the CRIB. And we're really delighted to hear about their work, partially supported by the Leong Center. We're very proud of that. So I will pass it on to you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? Good. Yeah, okay. All right. So that's the teacher in me, the call and response. Deshaun and I are delighted to be with you here today, not just for the purpose of sharing findings from our study entitled In the Aftermath, designed to understand the coping strategies of African, Caribbean, and Black youth who reside in Toronto and are disproportionately impacted by homicide, violence, and victimization, but to also understand and expand our learning that took place while doing this research. I think that's a really important fact that we want to bring along. So before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to formally thank the Leong Center for supporting this project. And also, if I may, also being just as excited about the work as we are. That came across so many of our interactions, and we really appreciate that. So thank you so much for the way that you enter the space with us. So I want to provide some context relevant to homicide throughout our global community. On average, each year, roughly 2,760 murders occur in the United States. And what you'll hear many people say is that compared to other forms of violent crime, that number is fairly low. However, when you think about who the majority of homicide victims are, young Black men and women living in urban areas, and when you realize that although Black people make up only 14% of the United States population, and yet they account for more than half of homicide victims. And when you understand that on average, African Americans experience the homicide of a loved one at least 2 times in their lifetime, we begin to realize that we are dealing with an epidemic that disproportionately impacts some of our most vulnerable. Now, this overrepresentation of Black homicide victims is not unique to the United States. In Canada, on average, 729 murders occur in Canada each year. And out of the 13 provinces and territories, the numbers are often highest in Ontario. And in 2024, racialized populations accounted for 29% of homicide victims, 45% who identified as African, Caribbean, Black. In Jamaica, on average, Jamaicans experience 1,372 murders each year. In South Africa, on average, South Africans experience 20,763 murders each year. Now, why am I bringing up those countries in particular when we think about the diverse array of diversity within Ontario and Canada? We begin to understand the threads of connection and how homicide is very far-reaching. Between 2015 and 2025, Toronto experienced 806 homicides, the highest number of murders of any city in the province, averaging 80 homicides per year. Now, Redmond and Doka suggest that each homicide victim has at least 7 to 10 family members and friends who are struggling to cope with the homicides of their loved one. But the numbers alone don't allow for us to see that for Black people, our relationship to one another extends far beyond blood ties and country borders. So the ripple effect, if you will, and impact of homicide is far-reaching, suggesting that the number of family members and friends is far greater than research predicts. In addition, when we consider the frequency in which homicide occurs in Black communities throughout the global diaspora, the United States, Canada, the Caribbean, Africa, and Brazil, you begin to understand that we are dealing with a disproportionate number of Black people who are struggling to make sense out of that which is senseless. The numbers alone, devoid of both social and cultural context, contributes to gaps in research, policy, and practice, often allowing for false narratives to be made about the causes and consequences of experiencing the homicide of a loved one for Black communities. And these false narratives result in mistrust in formal institutions such as university systems, our justice system, mental and medical health care systems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want us to take a moment to really understand the disproportionate reality of homicide for Black people. Specifically, I want you to think about who Black survivors of homicide victims are. They are your clients, peers, students, your child's coach, your mechanic, our military, or your colleagues, the pilot that offered a soft landing home from your last vacation, your grocery store clerk, family members, your children's friends. They are people you come in contact with every day who look just like me. They might even be you. So it's with this understanding of who they are and how we are all impacted, we are better positioned to not only understand the prevalence of cumulative Black death, we begin to comprehend the traumatic pandemic of grief that disproportionately devastates Black communities. And it's with this understanding, we are better informed about ways we might support and intervene. Now, you may be thinking, as tragic as homicide is, I can't relate to the Black experience. Or perhaps you're thinking that the subject matter is not related to your area of expertise or your organization's focus. I want to take a moment to think about that. Really think about that. When we consider the plethora of systems and services that survivors of homicide victims engage with on a daily basis, as well as the ones they need and interact with as a result of experiencing the murder of a loved one, social work, medical and mental health, public health care systems, education, law, justice, criminology, and socio-legal services, public policy, technology, engineering, data science, faith-based institutions, global affairs, and sociology. I was like, what? Did I miss one? You begin to understand that you as residents, faculty, practitioners, students, community leaders, and policymakers, you play a pivotal role in what should and could be a national response to this under-researched and unacknowledged pandemic of grief. What we must also keep in mind is that Black people are not only grieving the pervasive murder of family members and friends on a global scale, but they also experience collective trauma as a result of seeing the constant brutal erasure of us over social media streams played over and over and over again. This chronic exposure to cumulative Black death, wherein even if you are not related to the victim, you see yourselves, you see your sons, your daughters, your brothers and sisters in these images. This collective trauma contributes to the grief of our humanity and our safety at pandemic proportions. And it does something to you. It shatters your soul. These individual and collective experiences of homicide impact the mental and physical and spiritual well-being of Black survivors of homicide victims, leading to a ubiquity of injustice that complicates and disenfranchises their ability to grieve. If by chance, a murder is captured on video, we wait with bated breath for the perpetrators to be brought to trial and convicted, holding out for some shred of acknowledgement and recognition that we have the right to jog while Black, drive while Black, order coffee while Black, pray while Black, talk on a cell phone while Black, sleep in your own home while Black, protest while Black, grocery shop while Black, enter your dorm room while Black, bird watch while Black, skateboard while Black, Eat ice cream in your own home while Black. Pick up your siblings and make it home safely while Black. Breathe while Black. We experience the ubiquity of injustice not only in the collective viewing of our demise or during trials, but we also experience it when the prevalence of Black homicide is not acknowledged due to the lack of race-based data collection, as was the case in Canada until 2020, or when race-based data on homicide is available, as is the case in the United States. Absent from the discussion, however, is the overrepresentation of Black homicides, particularly as it pertains to Black cisgendered and trans women. When we think about the systematic way anti-Black racism permeates the very fabric of our society, affecting like a relentless virus of violent inequity, those structures that Black people rely upon for their survival, we have a responsibility to take action. When we recognize the fundamental causes of inequity, we understand the root causes of homicide. We begin to understand that vulnerability to homicide and victimization isn't caused by one factor, but by a combination of racial and systemic injustices. Black homicide is a structural issue that is rooted in anti-Black racism, period, full stop. And as a result of the unfertile soil, anti-Black racism produces structural inequities, income, education inequality, and healthcare inequality, over-policing. And these violent inequities lead to a level of social toxicity that increases the vulnerability of Black people to both homicide and the traumatic aftermath of grief. Chronic exposure to homicide leaves in its wake. It's with this understanding that we begin to recognize a fundamental truth. As long as we continue to root Black communities in infertile soil, we will continue to bear strange fruit. With this project, we are beginning to offer a framework that might change that. Now, in this moment, some of you may be thinking, well, finally, we are going to get to discuss the impact of homicide on Black youth. If that is what you're thinking, I want to invite you to consider the fact that I've been talking about them all along. Providing support and services to Black youth requires that we first must understand the social cultural context in which you and young Black survivors of homicide victims are operating in. This understanding starts with recognizing that race is a powerful organizing principle in our society. There is no behavior that we participate in that is not in some way shaped by race, and it is deeply significant, yet we deny that significance. We also have difficulty discussing it, which exacerbates the awkwardness around such discussions. When we think of racial issues as outside of ourselves, it's much harder to have a meaningful, progressive conversation. It's a deeper presence when we consider how it acts out in our lives, the lives of the Black families and children you work with, contributing to the presence of disenfranchised grief, complex intergenerational trauma that all impact the ways in which Black youth navigate surviving chronic exposure to the unthinkable tragedy of homicide. Now, when we think about homicide and its impact, young Black survivors of homicide victims are more likely to report a history of adverse childhood experiences, exposure to structural and interpersonal violence. Media often normalizes and dismisses Black homicide, creating misalignment with the emotional response, treating those survivors as adults versus children robbed of innocence. Young Black survivors of homicide victims experience disturbance in their sleep, self-esteem, trust, and sense of safety. Signs and symptoms of traumatic grief in Black youth, and this is not certainly an exhaustive list. Repeat exposure to traumatic injury can lead to the expression of grief through depression, suicidality, violence, social isolation, and substance abuse. Hypervigilance, never being able to rest because you are constantly have your head, as many of the participants described, head on a swivel, thinking about the next murder that's going to happen in your community. And now, while I know many of you all out there are familiar with this concept, I want to think about its application specifically as it applies to young Black survivors of homicide victims. When we consider the frequency in which Black communities are chronically exposed to homicide, Black youth and their families are deprived of the ability to mourn, to grieve, to take a breath before they experience yet another murder. When we consider the lack of race-based data that could bring attention to the prevalence of traumatic experiences like this, the experience of Black youth and their families are not fully recognized. When we consider the role of anti-Black racism creating structural inequities, service systems can contribute as well as be perceived as barriers to having safe places to grieve for Black youth and their families, as you'll see from the voices of some of the participants in our study. Black communities grieving as a result of experiencing structural and interpersonal and political and socio-legal violence often find themselves taking bold risks in their efforts to cope with such tragedies. The audacity to grieve these forms of violence is often illustrated in the form of political protest, anger, and disillusionment in systems tasked with the responsibility to provide legal, mental, and medical health care services. The tragic irony is that for Black people, the audacity to be fearless as one grieves, courageous as one grieves, vulnerable as one grieves, and yes, angry as one grieves, is not often met with the same level of support and understanding as we have seen displayed for other populations. That's why this work is so very important, to be able to position ourselves to be more culturally responsive in our continuity of care. Please forgive the typo here. Now you're all looking for it. In the Aftermath was designed to examine the root causes and consequences of homicide for Black youth ages 12 to 16 in the GTA for the purpose of informing the development of culturally responsive interventions. The project consisted of two components. The first, interviews with Black youth impacted by homicide, and the second, participants' creation of a digital story that focused on the impact of their experiences with homicide and how they cope with it. The findings we are presenting to you here today are from the interview portion of the study. The digital story was screened at the TIFF Lightbox Theater on March 1st last year, and thank you all for attending. I really appreciate it. So here's a map in the Aftermath focused on 6 neighborhoods that have experienced the greatest number of homicides over the past 5 years and have a large population of African Caribbean Black people: North and South Jane and Finch, Malvern, Rexdale, Regent Park, and Kingston Galloway. The team, so our sample was 8 African Caribbean and Black youth. And we held 8 interviews with those youth, and then a subsample, roughly 4 individuals agreed that they wanted to actually go through the training and create a digital story. The participants in our sample were ages 12 to 16, and it was a 50-50 split in terms of those who identified as male and female. Again, 2 components: interview method, digital storytelling. These interviews were conducted virtually over Zoom, facilitated by our neighborhood ambassadors. And I want to give a shout out to the Story Center, our project partners, who facilitated the training with the participants and helped them learn how to create their own digital stories. The analysis involved an inductive thematic analysis with the neighborhood ambassadors and members of our research team, as well as for the purpose of really being able to inform or develop a theoretical framework that would then inform the development of intervention. I do want to emphasize here that this was an intense process of data analysis with our neighborhood ambassadors as well as our research team. And after we went through that process, we actually went back to some of the participants for member checking to say, is this reflective of what you expressed in the interviews? Now, I understand that community engaged research is not the appropriate method for every study, but I do believe it is the right approach when you are exploring an under-researched phenomenon with populations who have been marginalized and disenfranchised, as I've just expressed, by the very systems that were designed and supposed to protect them. Doing this work this way requires a sense of humility. We're going to talk about that. A recognition of invaluable expertise beyond your own, and an ability to relinquish power and control. Hush, Deshawn, We'll talk about it later. Don't throw me on the bus yet. Stay lit. And I'm inviting that into the space before I hand it off to Deshawn, because if it were not for Deshawn and many of the neighborhood ambassadors who participated in our Invisible Wounds project, which was funded by Sharpe, where they did the same thing, interviews and digital stories, who said, we want more of this, A, but two, you need to start younger. You need to reach out to the younger youth. I would not have been positioned, if I didn't listen, I would not be well positioned to write the grant and be. So I just want to thank you probably yet again for doing that. But this is the kind of work, and I absolutely love it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Deshawn, who's going to talk a little bit about the Neighborhood Ambassadors Program, and then we'll flip back to findings.
Hello, everybody. So I'm here to talk about the Neighborhood Ambassador Program. I think the Neighborhood Ambassador Program is like, I would call it like the bread and butter of the research that we do, because the neighborhood ambassadors, we make sure that they're from the communities we plan on conducting this research in. So because we're in these high priority neighborhoods that have all of this trauma, we make sure that our neighborhood ambassadors come from these same neighborhoods. So upon doing our recruitment that is very thorough in these neighborhoods, for somebody that could act as like a liaison between us and like the research team and the community, we found like that would be our best way in, and having people from those neighborhoods understanding the traumas, understanding what the neighborhoods are going through, being trauma informed and being culturally appropriate, those things would help us tenfold. Also, some of the things that the neighborhood ambassador coordinators have to go through is an intense REB training where they're able to go back into their communities and conduct this research safely and ethically appropriate. So it becomes like a big snowball effect as we go into this community for this research, but we get people out of the community to help us conduct the research and then start building up their resume. It starts bringing power back to the community. So now the community, that helps us break down these barriers that the communities usually have with us when we're coming in with University of Toronto, coming to do research in these communities. Everybody's so standoffish, especially in my community, to be exact. It's like we're always worried about what type of information do you guys want? Who's gonna twist and turn our words around and put something else out that we don't want? So it becomes like such an empowering role for the neighborhood ambassador to now be a part of breaking down these barriers, disseminating the information back into the community, and just rebuilding that trust and bringing back the love for research. There's many times that at the end of these focus groups, we have people saying, the participants saying like, wow, I've never done nothing like this before. And actually like, this actually feels good. It feels good. When can we do this again? That's comes to the part where we have to start pumping the brakes and letting them know that we only do research. We don't do programming, but then we start noticing that gap. That gap and that want for more. Like these groups they become so therapeutic to the community. It's like, how do we do this again? Like, when are we doing this again? Besides, like, is it next week? And then that's when we're at that pause and we got to bring it back to Dr. Sharpe. Like, where do we go from here with these type of stuff?
Just write the grants.
Exactly. Exactly. So, those type of things that we've been noticing, they happen a lot, but we try to work our best with like continuing to support the communities to the best as we can and ensuring that when we're done with the research, we bring them back the research findings and break it down into the most, I don't want to say layman terms, but ensuring that they can understand it. We've been thinking of ways to dismember the information back into the community, if it's like pictos, like pictures, just to break it down to the most layman's terms so they can also understand what came back from these researchers and stuff and be a part of it throughout the whole steps, knowing that their neighborhood ambassador is from there. So they're telling them, okay, now we had to pause at the research, we got our findings, now we're doing the data analysis and how that's going. And just them knowing that we got somebody that's really from here looking out for our best cause, conducting this research, and just bringing the love back to them. Yes, exactly. So the recruitment role, so that part is amazing. I find that like some of the best parts are our neighborhood ambassadors now. They come up with new strategies because they're from these communities of how to get the right people to conduct these researches. Sometimes from coming from the community, you can be seeing University of Toronto come and it's like, hey, we're conducting research. And like, I've been that person, like, don't really trust you guys. So I might just I might just answer the questions to the best, just to answer, just so I could probably get the honorarium at the end or something. But now with these neighborhood ambassadors, meeting these participants at different places, we're not just recruiting in universities, we're going to barbershops, we're going to the mall, we're going to the mosques, we're going to anywhere that we can meet the people at basketball places, just to give that real approach, understanding, hey, maybe I can't do it right now. We're going to conduct this focus group about 8 o'clock in the evening after people are done doing their childcare and their school and stuff. Just all of those culturally appropriate steps we've been finding that have been very successful, especially in the priority communities. And also making sure that, like we said, the neighborhood ambassadors are fully trained with the RAB, the intensive RAB training, that to make sure that they're conducting this research safely and appropriately.
One of the things they also go through, it's about 28 hours of training, post-homicide, anti-oppressive practices, how do we do trauma research. I also want to give a shout out to Kevin Haynes, who is basically the mental health consultant on all of our projects. So if neighborhood ambassadors and or participants are feeling the way or need to be connected to services, we actually have a soft handoff to Kevin, who was also very present in our debriefing with this particular population as well. So thank you, Kevin, for that work. The other thing I want to also emphasize is the way in which neighborhood ambassadors work is such a beautiful thing. Each of them had sort of familiarity with different priority neighborhoods. But if they were stuck in terms of recruitment, we would have weekly debriefing and check-ins in terms of half of the time would be spent talking about what was the recruitment, can we problem solve how to recruit different participants, but also what is happening in the community. In real time during this project, I think there were about 5 homicides at some of the that neighborhood ambassadors and some of our participants were intimately connected to. So imagine you're doing your research project, but you have to stop and pause, check in with folks, see how they're doing, make sure they're connected to resources. I want to uplift that into the conversation because when you're doing this work, it's really important to be able to stop, pause, assess, and adjust. And check in. I always was checking with neighborhood ambassadors. What is going on? How are you feeling? What's happening? I just saw this shooting was happening. Do we need to have a different session? So it's much more than what appears on your grant application or your paper that comes beyond that work.
I think the participants really appreciate that too, being that you see, like she said, Dr. Sharpe said, we've been doing research and like people have been losing people while we're conducting this research. But because we got those neighborhood ambassadors, they understand, hey, we just lost somebody in our community 2 days ago. So this focus group might be super heavy. Potentially one of the participants have lost the person that they was lost in the community was a close relative to this participant. So we're checking in on them. We're looking out for certain signs or signals during the focus group, if their camera comes off, if they're extra quiet, and we're giving them the ability to like take a pause when needed. All of those things are very crucial that when we're conducting this research.
Thank you. So switching gears to the findings, an analysis of the interviews with our participants revealed the following 3 overarching themes. Active coping strategies were utilized to manage the trauma that many of our participants were experiencing, such as playing sports, music, peer relationships, to manage that emotional distress. Environmental stressors such as violence, drug violence, community violence that they're hearing, drug use, homelessness, and over-policing amplified the trauma that they were experiencing, and an ambivalence towards formal mental health services due to cultural stigma, a lack of relatable providers, and the absence of homicide-specific resources. So, active coping strategies first. Several participants reported that accessing formal services was difficult because they were either never informed about available support or their situation was not considered a priority. We had several participants talk about that. Participants also shared a lack of trust that their request would be given proper attention due to previous negative experiences with the legal system, managing the homicide cases of their loved ones. So I just want to also uplift that our preliminary data across many of our projects is showing that African, Caribbean, and Black individuals experience the murder of a loved one on average, not once, not twice, but at least 3 times. So this is a quote from Akeem. When I'm feeling angry, I don't like to be at home because I know for a fact I'm probably going to get more mad if I'm in the house doing nothing. So usually I just go to my nearest basketball court and I just shoot hoops until I get tired. So Akeem here explicitly identifies staying still as the threat to his emotional regulation, and physical activity as the anecdote. His reasoning is deliberate. He is not simply doing something he enjoys, but making a protective cognitive choice. The phrase "until I get tired" also points to the somatic function of sport, exhausting the body as a way of quieting the mind. Deshaun wants me to write a grant for basketball. But we have Patricia. If we're feeling angry, I like to sit in my room and just let it sit. Because when I'm angry, I tend to take it out on other people that don't deserve it. So sitting in my room with calming music or anything, it just really helps for me personally. Patricia articulates a form of self-awareness and emotional containment, withdrawing not out of avoidance, but as a protective strategy to reduce the likelihood that they might take their anger out on someone else. The pairing of solitude and calming music creates a private coping environment. And take note that Patricia's strategy is the counterpart to Akeem's, showing that even within the same close peer group, active coping strategies may look different, but the intent is still the same. I think there's something to uplift and further examine in terms of gender differences, access, all of those things. Environmental stressors. One thing, Nathan, is one thing I definitely don't like about my neighborhood. I woke up to the police sirens and a lot of gun violence, and I don't feel like it's a fit for me. I wake up to sirens and all of that, and I just really don't like it. The phrase "I don't feel like it's a fit for me" is quietly devastating. It captures a young person's sense of misalignment between himself and the environment he has no choice but to inhabit. The daily soundtrack of sirens is not background noise. It is a chronic stressor layered beneath and around the acute trauma of losing a friend to gun violence. This theme was repeated throughout participant narratives, this study, in Rise YB Men's study, and our Invisible Wound study. And I just want to uplift in this conversation that it really signals to us that there's no post-traumatic stress for Black people. There's no post. It is constant. It is relentless. So you do not have time to relax and breathe and process before another one happens. Tiffany. I don't think it's a good environment, so it has a huge impact on certain people. I think once some people change the certain environment that they are in, it does change them as a person. I actually remember reading this transcript. Tiffany frames environmental stress as a formidable force, not merely a backdrop, but an active shaper of identity. Right? This ecological awareness speaks directly to the study's framework. However, Tiffany does not position the environment as stagnant or inevitable. The statement, "once some people change," implies agency and the possibility of transformation and hope, which is in itself a form of resilience. Ambivalence toward formal mental health services. Access to service providers who share racial and cultural identity with survivors in the study was extremely important to participants. Someone who's relatable, like the neighborhood ambassadors. And several respondents described the process of grieving as involving a diverse intersection of cultural rituals and traditions. There's Tiffany. My mom actually did try getting schools to provide a therapist so we can talk to people about it. But my brothers, they think they're all so cool and they don't need to talk to anybody about it. The line, "They think they're all so cool," reveals how cultural stigma around mental health help seeking is understood within families, but particularly along gender lines. And there's something there we have to uplift and examine. Talk about that in our groups. The mother's effort to access school-based support illustrates both a desire for formal help and the resistance that prevents it from being utilized, whether that's internal resistance, whether that's not knowing what's available, etc. So the question becomes why? Why the resistance?
And it's funny, they resist the therapist from like school, but when we're in the group setting, they're like, wow,
They
I
want it.
want this again. And it's like, you know, this is kind
This
of
is
like,
Right.
but we don't do that.
Right.
Right.
So true. Zane, no support. It was me and my family dealt with it ourselves and dealt with it how we could. So no support statement carries weight. There is no apparent anger or grievance in the statement, and the absence of formal support has been absorbed as normal, right? Not as a deprivation, but just normal. So we're just going to deal with it. We're just going to figure it out. And the phrase how we could implies making do in the absence of formal resources.
I was gonna say this question, I remember coming to these questions with the participants, and it was always like a joke to them. Like when we're like, have you got any support post losing whoever? And it's like, what are you talking about? You know, like they laugh about it. Like, what support? Like how, where, what are you talking about? Like or like, you know, and they're like, no, like that was never a thing. We just deal with it within our family and stuff. So it's unfortunate.
And Tiffany, again, making sure that they for sure feel comfortable enough to even talk about the situation, because some people don't feel comfortable. Some people feel untrusted. Separating the type of deaths would also help. One group for talking about shootings and death, one group for talking about stabbings, definitely separating the types of death. So this was interesting. Tiffany's not simply identifying a gap, she's designing a solution, right? Grounded in lived experience. Her instances on her talking about homicide-specific support groups suggest that generic grief programming that collapses different kinds of loss into a single category just won't do, right? The word untrusted also surfaces the relational dimensions of ambivalence. It is not only stigma that keeps youth from looking to formal systems for support, but a fundamental question of whether those systems can be trusted. So just gave you a brief, because we have 45, you want to ask questions, just gave you some brief quotes. But there are some policy implications here. And again, not an exhaustive list, but we have to examine the long-term effectiveness of informal active coping in terms of sports, music, journaling, in the absence of professional support. Apply ecological frameworks to measure how chronic neighborhood violence compounds both acute and long-term grief responses. I think using participatory action research designs that position bereaved Black youth, neighborhood ambassadors as co-designers of homicide-specific grief programs is actually the next direction that we're taking in our own work at the crib. And then some policy implications. Locate grief support resources and spaces where Black youth already gather, period. Don't make them come to you. Let's go to them. Establish clear school-based protocols for student homicide bereavement. This has been a recommendation in my work in Baltimore, Maryland, in my work in Chicago, and in my work here. High rates of homicide, violence, and victimization, but there's not a protocol. So usually what happens is when I get called in, right, to do a training is the student is taking a test or has been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder or is exhibiting aggressive behaviors. When you peel back the layers of the onion, that young student witnessed their uncle being murdered on the way to the corner store. But we're not doing a constant assessment, even though we know that it's so prevalent, right? So we have to do a better job of even doing the assessment to be able to inform what sort of protocol we should have in school systems in our medical and mental health care facilities, et cetera. Fund and formalize peer-led community-based support models, including paid roles for community members. Neighborhood ambassadors were not doing this work for free. Our mental health consultant was not doing this work. We were paying individuals for their expertise and time. And ensure grief support is provided to all families. This comes up over and over again, not just in this study, but in others, that if we understand, for example, Black people have family members that are not necessarily related by blood. You cannot tell me my Aunt Barbara's not my Aunt Barbara. She's not related by blood, but she's Aunt Barbara. If we know this to be true, but our victim services support basically require that individuals have to be related by blood to get access to services, we're not providing culturally responsive services to this population. Practice implications, build on existing active coping strategies, map what youth are already doing, and amplify those strategies in tandem with anti-oppressive clinical frameworks. Responsive listening is the foundation. Trust must precede technique. Now, you might be saying this is so obvious, but I'm inviting it into the conversation because trust is hard to earn, but really easy to lose. And if we think about, I spent time, the first 15 minutes, laying the foundation of the structural inequities and structural violence that are happening. There's a lot of mistrust there before we even get to talking about a homicide. So if it's hard, if it's difficult, if people aren't showing up, I just need you to understand the why that's in the background of this, right? The backdrop of the trauma that's informing what might be serving as a barrier. And usually that's rooted in trust and credibility, not just because of you've done something, but there's a larger systemic issue at play. Trained practitioners. So one of the things that I have developed is a post-homicide training certificate program. It's nice if people invite me to do a talk or a lecture, but how are we creating sustainable change? How are we providing individuals with the skill sets to be able to put all of these pieces together in their own practice? So thus far, I have trained the Parole Board of Canada, and they're actually African, Caribbean, and Black officers that go into provide culturally responsive, I'm losing my words, culturally responsive programming. It'll come back. It'll come back. It's going to be good, you guys. And then also in Chicago, actually this fall. So really that puts all of the pieces together and provides a training for service providers. Offer group programming grouped by cause of death, as Tiffany alluded to, and integrate structural awareness into direct practice. How are we actually understanding the structural inequities that are in violence that are at play, and that these two traumas, the trauma of homicide and the structural violence, are always at play? And then if we understand it from that perspective, how we're positioning ourselves, not only to provide a service, but to serve as advocates, right? For being able to help our clients navigate these systems. So that's really important. So where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? While study results are not generalizable, I know the sample is small. Findings from the study do provide a foundation for which we can begin to build upon, right? So our next steps are to analyze the digital stories themselves. We haven't finished doing that. Develop an intervention in collaboration with youth and NAs. We've done this with our RISE programming that we received funding from November, which is an online program for young Black men who are surviving the homicide of a loved one. We want to be able to do something in person, perhaps that includes recreation and arts. It works from this, and we got that from participants that they didn't want to stop meeting, like they didn't want to stop meeting. Offer post-homicide training certificate program for service providers and organizations. All right, thank you.
I think the participants really love those parts because it's re-empowering the community. You know, that's one thing as being a neighborhood ambassador coordinator, just seeing the empowerment. Me, like Dr. Sharpe said, I started off as a participant. I came through the program, and then one day, Dr. Sharpe, I don't know if she's gonna tell the story, but she just woke up one day and called me like 10 a.m. She's like, I got an idea, Deshaun. I'm like, okay, or maybe after 12, but she's like, yes, let's start a neighborhood ambassador program. And like, it was amazing being in the program and then being offered a position to be a neighborhood ambassador coordinator and just feeling that pride. I got to walk into my community and say like, hey, look, we're gonna make research fun again. We're gonna make it safe again. You know, we're gonna at least try, take it one step at a time, and then being able to give other people from different communities that are marginalized and prior, like high priority neighborhoods like myself, giving those other people from those neighborhoods the same opportunity and seeing the same smile and just breaking down those barriers. And you know, it's just been an amazing run, and it's just something that we just look forward to keeping up.
Thank you all. Very much. Great talk, very inspiring. Any questions? We'll start with the room. Yeah, Tasha.
That was great to see. You mentioned earlier about hypervigilance as something that you see, and in clinical practice, I see that all the time as a major, something that's not really measurable, and affects every single decision people make and the way they go about their day. But it doesn't, when people experience violence and homicide, it doesn't apply to everybody. And I wonder if you've seen any patterns in who is more hypervigilant and who is not? And are there any things that we can learn from those who don't develop that hypervigilance in their communities that we can build on?
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it in several different ways. I think that in my research, how hypervigilance is showing up in different ways. I think it is there for everyone, but it's actually showing up in very different ways. And I think the difference, and again, this is just anecdotal because I haven't actually asked the question, assessed, whatever, and I'd have to look back. But I think, for example, and I know you're going to chime in, with young Black men in particular, it is a hypervigilance in terms of who do I have around me? What are my surroundings? What neighborhood am I in that might differ from my own? Colors, tattoos, decals, like all of those things are signaling like can be triggers to whether the hypervigilance goes high or low. But I think it's always there when you think about just the constant sort of way in which we're exposed to gun violence, shootings, crime violence, as one of the participants indicated. And again, anecdotally, for the young girls that we've interviewed, hypervigilance is there, but I feel like it is more internalized. And so it comes up in like Tiffany, or I forgot when it was, Patricia, the music. She always talked about the headphones, wearing the headphones to block it out. Like she's aware, but she's blocking it out so that she can feel safe or insulated, right? So it's those kinds of things that show up. Would you like to?
Yes, I would say with the hypervigilance, like it comes at us as so many different ways, right? You like Dr. Sharpe was saying, we're seeing it on Instagram all day. And then some people are just seeing it on Instagram all day, but at home it's a safe environment. But some people are seeing it at Instagram all day, then they go outside and they're seeing it frontline, right, in their community all day. Like somebody died yesterday and they know this is community to community politics. So they know like there's gonna be a retaliation. It's coming back within the week. So some people express it differently. Hence the reason I've been pushing for the sports and the arts, the ways to release these stresses, different ways. You know, I would see usually the people that have more structure behind them, these youth in the community that are already in basketball, karate, or soccer, they have these teams that they can connect to. When these problems happen, they got soccer on Saturday. So if somebody dies Wednesday, they got soccer on Saturday. Yes, they can grieve, but they also have a release point on the weekend versus the kid where it's like, I don't got nothing in the community. This guy died on Wednesday. When Jamal's at soccer on Saturday, I'm at home still in the community like, damn, Leong died, you know, still. So these people now are picking up different ways to release it. They get the time to sit down and say, let's go for revenge. Let's group up. Let's make a little team right now and go get revenge because I can't go play soccer. I don't got the funds to be on the football team. You know, I don't have a dad, you know, somebody to talk to me and tell me, hey, this is what we need. So that's how I sometimes see the difference in the hypervigilance and how it shows, how they're like inputting it back into the community.
And I also think asking the question in your clinical setting about have you made adjustments to your walk to work, your walk to home, right? That will be very telling because it's so palpable and it's so normalized that it's happening, but it's just like, oh yeah, I just don't go there because I know what's happening on the street corner. I just don't go over there after a certain time because I know this. Or actually I make sure somebody's with me. So they're making adjustments to navigate the environment that is toxic.
And then there's the others that say, no, I'm not navigating it. Okay, if this is what it is, then I'm gonna be a part of the war as well too. You know, how do you wrong them sometimes, right? Like I'm not gonna make a beeline to get to school. I'm gonna walk this way. And if this problem comes to me, I'm gonna be strapped for it. I'm gonna be ready to match violence with violence. So we got some people thinking that way and some thinking the other way, unfortunately. And then who do you tell that person you're wrong? Right? When like he lost his brother, his cousin, his sister, all to gun violence, nobody, not even necessary, but like now he doesn't want to make a beeline to go to school to be safe. He wants to say, you know what, all right, let's roll with the punches. I already lost half of my family, so who am I next? I might as well, you know. So a lot of people are taking different routes with it, you know. And then the social media, it's all of this retaliation. It's like a thing. It's like a culture. You know, you got. You don't want to get political, but we see all the way up to politics. It's you see the hypervigilance and the aggressive responses. Everybody wants to be, you know, put on this tough shield first, right? It's not. It's really less of talking and working things out. It's really everybody's taking that the high violence route. Well, not everybody, but you know, majority.
The question.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very informative. I am interested in learning more from your perspective about community engaged research as a process, as a philosophy, as a way of doing work and giving back to the community, but also learning about your experiences. If someone is interested in taking on this responsibility and this work, how should they go about doing it? Recognizing that often the places that fund us and the institutions that we represent have created harm. And how do we navigate that?
Love this question. So the first thing I do is I don't go anywhere where I'm not going to be invited. Right? So I might say, I have this thing, I have this idea, what do you think? And if the community is not, or community members that I'm speaking to, or community agents I'm not speaking to is not driving, I usually ask why, or, you know, what could be changed, or those kinds of things on those questions. The second thing, I say the hard parts out loud so they don't have to. Deshaun will tell you. Every time we start a project, I say I'm gonna make mistakes, but I also say I recognize I'm from U of T, and U of T is and continues to do tremendous harm to our communities. And the look on their face is like, oh my, she said that publicly out loud. And I'm like, yes, but here's how I want to do it differently, but I can't do it I don't want, this is too important. I don't want to mess this up. So would you consider partnering with me, right? In this journey together to create these research questions to address this issue. But I have those really hard I say it, I just say it. I recognize the harm, but this is how I want to do it differently. And I think the third thing is really making sure that in my structure, that my dean, that other individuals know that I'm going to take my time with this research, right? The trauma and the structural violence that individuals have experienced has gone on for centuries. So for you to expect that I'm going to go into this community or these communities and in 2-3 weeks time, just, poof, you know, it is right. So we've got to take some time to go to car washes and bake sales, to have conversations, to have dinner, these guys know I feed them, we're breaking bread all the time. All right, I'm not cooking this time. We do all these things, right? To be able to just have human conversation before we even begin the process of thinking like that. So those are the 3 big ticket items. I don't know if you have something else to add.
I think you touched on most of it, but I think being intentional about building a connection first, right? And also giving the community that opportunity to participate and highlighting the empowerment they get from being a part of this research, bringing those things to the forefront, because coming from these communities, you grow up and it's like, okay, research is bad. Be careful what you're saying to these people, blah, blah, blah. It's just a generational trauma. But when you bring it to somebody now and put these things on the forefront, you be honest, you be open, and you give them the autonomy to find some power within this, you'll be surprised, and not being research first, but people first, right? So, research needs to be conducted. There's timelines and there's stuff that needs to get done. But before you just jump into the community, hey, and do the elevator pitch, maybe pass by a couple times, maybe, be a part of a community event before you go and dive into that research, be a little strategic, and like plant some wellness seeds, I'll call it, before you just dive right in. And that liaison, getting a liaison, a neighborhood ambassador from the community, finding out who's the pillars and what they've been through and getting a little bit of history. People are so appreciative of you knowing a little bit about them or their community, when we come in, me mentioning a popular, not a popular person, but somebody from the neighborhood that does well in their community, kind of, oh, that person, Sandy, wow, a little barrier comes down. Not all, but it's like, okay, you actually know people, and you're actually making these intentional connections.
The other thing I wanted to mention is, oh my gosh, I just lost it. I always get questions or asked, because I identify as a Black woman, isn't it easier? And that's not true. Black people are not a monolith. And so I'm originally from the United States. And so there was a lot of sort of cultural nuances to learn, to take up, to navigate. So really just being vulnerable with, I don't know that neighborhood, particularly with those guys, I don't know that neighborhood, or can you tell me, or can you take me there, or those kinds of things. The last thing I will say is, don't make promises you can't keep. And really being clear with individuals about reciprocity, what you're asking for and what are you willing to give, and coming to some general consensus and understanding. I can give this, but I can't do that. And being clear about how long research takes and the process, and being able to repeat it over and over again. REB nearly took us out, particularly with Black youth who have experienced homicide between the ages of 12 to 16. I think it was 6 to 8 months? I mean, I was like, can we have an extension? We have an extension. It was sick. Thank you all. 6 to 8 months to even get the IRB, and revision after revision after revision. And so while these guys are in the hopper, like, are we ready to go? Are we ready to go? I've got kids lined up, right? So just being clear about the process, particularly with your team.
And if I could ask a follow-up, do you think the academy, the ivory tower, is ready for this kind of work, both in terms of who gets hired, who gets promoted, who gets visibility, who gets the bigger and bigger grants?
Oh boy. I did too. I want to say that it's been my experience that we're getting there. And also I'm a bit of a pit bull. And so the way that I kind of do it, I was like, particularly with, I reference policy, or as I tell my students, I pull out the receipts. Our mission and our vision and values is what? Wait, so are we going to do this, or are we not going to do this? Like, help me help you, because we want to get to this vision and values. So the grants, the presentations, the conversations I'm having behind the doors, even when I was hiring, and I've been very honest with them, neighborhood ambassadors, and getting questions that I wouldn't get when I'm hiring students. I was like, so we're not gonna have this conversation, right? Because it seems like you didn't ask, so just, you didn't ask this question when I hired this person, so why am I having, right? So how are we positioning ourselves to be better in this vision and mission that we were wanting to create together? So it's those kinds of conversations. I'm only helping you move our mission and vision along. Yes, makes sense? Okay, sorry. Oh, we're out of time.
We are.
Oh,
Can
darn.
I ask you one other question that related?
Yes.
If people have to go, for sure. It just relates to this and a piece about the social contract with the people with whom you engage and the sustainability. And I know a lot of the organizations that might be able to move on, tailor services or do work, probably don't have huge budgets, but I just wonder long-term, just about whether we have to think a little differently about applied research, and who funds what parts of it and the partnerships that could come out. Do you know what I mean? Because at some point you're gonna want to retire, right? And you don't want all that good work to go away. No, but I'm just saying, you don't want it to go away just because a research team's research funding has dried up or somebody decides or somebody gets sick or retire, so how do you embed it?
Yeah.
A little bit of that research mindset and the way in which you're interacting with communities for the long term.
That's why I created the Neighborhood Ambassadors Program. That's exactly why. Because I saw, I'm getting these grants, which is great, but the grant money dries up. What has happened, which is a beautiful thing, is the neighborhood ambassadors, and we have, I call them 5 OGs. We've trained 11 for another project, but they now have the skill sets where they're now working on another project for our mass shooting data analysis, a huge public data set where they're analyzing data. I have 2 researchers who have reached out to me because they know they were well trained. They know they can get access. And now they're working for that research lab, right? And so now, outside of the crib, they are now being picked up for different jobs, resources. I mean, it's funneled through the crib. We contract out to other research labs to do the work, but they know that they're getting what the product that they're getting and the expertise that the neighborhood ambassadors have. So that's one of the ways I'm thinking about it. I think the other thing I'm thinking about in terms of the crib is sort of global domination. Where I'm not doing all the things, but there's a center in Chicago, there's one in Baltimore, there's one in South Africa, as I talked to you about Kingston, Jamaica, and we're just doing the TA and training, but they all have their neighborhood ambassadors and the tentacles are reaching.